I'd never been one for camping. Growing up in the suburbs of Pennsylvania, I liked my comforts: central heating, running water, the hum of city life just beyond my window. But in the summer of 2023, after a year of working long hours as a freelance graphic designer, I needed an escape, a real one. My friends always raved about the calming effect of nature, so I decided to give it a shot. The campsite I chose was about 3 hours outside of Pittsburgh. It had been recommended in an online forum for secluded camping spots. Hidden gem, one review read. Perfect for solitude. That was exactly what I was looking for. The drive out there was uneventful. My car cut through rolling hills, dense forests, and the occasional small town. As I got closer to the site, the paved roads turned into gravel and cell service flickered out. I didn't mind. In fact, I welcomed the quiet. The campsite itself was in the middle of nowhere. I followed a narrow dirt trail until I reached a clearing surrounded by tall pines. There was a rusted fire pit, a broken wooden bench, and not much else. Perfect, I thought. I pitched my tent near the edge of the clearing, close enough to the trees for shade, but far enough to avoid any critters. The first day passed peacefully. I read a book, took a nap, and cooked some chili over a small fire. By nightfall, the sky was an ocean of stars. I sat by the fire, staring up at them, feeling more at ease than I had in years. But the second night was different. It started with a noise. I was lying in my tent, trying to fall asleep, when I heard it, a faint rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. My first thought was animals, a raccoon maybe, or a deer. I ignored it, pulling my sleeping bag tighter around me. The rustling grew louder. I sat up, my heart pounding. It sounded close, too close. Grabbing my flashlight, I unzipped the tent and shone the beam into the woods. The light caught nothing but trees and shadows. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe a small animal, and went back inside. But the sound didn't stop. For the next hour, I lay there, listening as the rustling moved in and out of the woods, circling the clearing. Every so often, it would stop, and I'd hold my breath, waiting for it to start again. When it finally did stop for good, I convinced myself I was overreacting. Camping alone in the woods was bound to make anyone a little jumpy. I eventually fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I woke up to find something strange. About 10 feet from my tent, there were footprints in the dirt. Not animal tracks, human footprints. They were large, probably from boots, and they circled my campsite. I stared at them, my stomach twisting into knots. Someone had been here last night, walking around while I slept. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a fellow camper who stumbled upon my site and didn't want to wake me. But there hadn't been any cars or signs of people when I arrived. Still, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe someone had just been passing through. I decided to stay another night, reasoning that if someone really wanted to harm me, they would have done it already. That evening, I couldn't relax. Every snap of a twig, every gust of wind put me on edge. By the time the sun set, I was sitting by the fire with a hunting knife in my lap. The forest around me felt different. The cheerful chirping of birds and rustling of squirrels had been replaced by an oppressive silence. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and my own breathing. Around midnight, the rustling started again. This time, it was louder, more deliberate. It wasn't just one spot. It was coming from all around me, as if someone was circling the campsite. I grabbed my flashlight and knife and stood by the fire, shining the beam into the woods. "Who's there?" I shouted, even though I knew no one would answer. The rustling stopped. I stood there for what felt like hours, my flashlight scanning the trees, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I backed into my tent, zipping it up and clutching the knife. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I'd made up my mind to leave. As much as I wanted to believe it was all in my head, the footprints and noises were too much to ignore. But when I stepped out of the tent, I froze. The campsite was trashed. My backpack had been emptied, its contents scattered across the ground. My food was gone, ripped open and eaten. But what scared me most were the footprints. They were everywhere, crisscrossing the clearing, leading up to my tent and back into the woods. Someone had been here watching me while I sat in the tent all night. I packed up as quickly as I could, shoving everything into my car and speeding back down the dirt trail. I thought that was the end of it. But a few weeks later, I saw a news story that made my blood run cold. A man had been arrested in the same area where I'd been camping. He was wanted for multiple murders, all of which had taken place in remote campsites. According to the police, he would stalk his victims for days, learning their routines before striking. The report showed a picture of him, disheveled, with wild eyes and a twisted smile. He looked like he belonged in a nightmare. As I stared at his face on the screen, I felt a chill run down my spine. The thought of how close I'd come to becoming one of his victims was almost too much to bear. For weeks, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those footprints outside my tent, heard the rustling in the woods. To this day, I haven't been camping again, and I never will. I never thought I'd find myself camping near the US border, but in the fall of 2014, I was driving cross-country and wanted to explore the wilderness along the way. I was 27 at the time, and the idea of solitude out in the open always appealed to me. I planned to camp in a remote area in Arizona, not far from the Mexican border. The area was sparsely populated and had plenty of rugged terrain to explore. After stopping in a small town to stock up on supplies, I found an isolated dirt road that led deep into the desert. I followed it for about an hour until it turned into little more than a rough trail. The GPS on my phone had long since stopped working, but I wasn't worried. I had a map and plenty of food and water. I picked a spot about 10 miles from the main road. It was perfect. The landscape was flat, with a few scattered shrubs and distant rocky hills. I parked my truck in a small clearing and set up camp. The first night was uneventful. The stars were brilliant, and the silence was so deep it felt like a physical presence. I cooked a simple meal over a campfire and went to bed early. The next day, I spent the morning hiking to one of the hills I had seen in the distance. The climb was tougher than I expected, but the view from the top was worth it. You could see for miles in every direction. The desert stretched out like an ocean, endless and empty. But it wasn't entirely empty. On my way back to camp, I noticed something strange. About a mile from my campsite, there were footprints in the dirt. At first, I thought they were mine, but they didn't match the tread on my boots. They were fresh, too. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe another camper or a rancher passing through. But it bothered me. The tracks led toward my campsite. When I got back, everything was just as I'd left it. My truck was fine, my gear was untouched. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. That night, I didn't make a fire. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I sat in the dark, eating a cold meal, listening to the wind and the distant howls of coyotes. The uneasy feeling from earlier hadn't gone away. I kept my flashlight and knife close by, just in case. I must have dozed off at some point, but I woke up abruptly, heart racing, to the sound of footsteps outside my tent. They were slow, deliberate, circling my camp. I froze. My first thought was that it might be an animal, but the steps were too heavy. I grabbed my flashlight and knife, my hands trembling. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. I held my breath, straining to hear. Then the zipper on my tent started to move. I shouted and lunged forward, slashing with my knife. The zipper stopped, and I heard whoever it was running off into the night. I scrambled out of the tent, flashlight in hand, but I couldn't see anything, just darkness and the outlines of shrubs. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At dawn, I packed up and decided to leave. But as I was loading my gear into the truck, I found something that made my stomach drop. A small, rusty knife lying on the ground near my tent. It wasn't mine. I got in the truck and started driving, eager to put as much distance as possible between me and that place. But about 5 miles down the road, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Parked on the side of the trail was another vehicle, a beat-up old van. It hadn't been there before. The windows were tinted, and I couldn't see inside. But I felt like I was being watched. I sped up, heart pounding, and didn't stop until I reached the main road. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the van following me, but it never appeared. For the rest of my trip, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching, waiting. Maybe it was just some drifter, someone who meant no harm. But the knife, the footsteps, the van, it all felt too deliberate. I haven't been camping alone since. Even now, years later, I think about that night. The desert was beautiful, but it hid something, someone who didn't belong. And every now and then, when I'm lying in bed at night, I hear the sound of footsteps in my mind, slow and deliberate, and I wonder if they ever stopped watching. I've been working as a security specialist for a private firm for a few years now. My job usually involves monitoring and securing sensitive sites, things like warehouses, construction sites, and occasionally private properties. It's not glamorous work, but it pays the bills and keeps me on my toes. Most nights, the job is boring. A few hours of walking a perimeter, checking locks, and writing reports. But every now and then, something happens that shakes you, something that stays with you. This story takes place a few years ago in 2019. I was 34 at the time, and my firm had recently taken on a contract to secure a large, mostly abandoned industrial site just outside of Macon, Georgia. The place was tucked into the woods, off a gravel road that didn't even show up on most maps. It used to be a small manufacturing plant that made parts for agricultural equipment, but it had shut down a decade earlier. Now, it was just a sprawling collection of old buildings, rusting equipment, and cracked concrete slabs surrounded by dense forest. The client had plans to redevelop the property, but in the meantime, they wanted someone to keep an eye on it. There had been reports of trespassers, and the company didn't want anyone stealing scrap metal or setting up camp. They hired my firm to have someone patrol the site overnight, and that someone turned out to be me. I remember the first night I drove out there. It was late September, and the air was heavy with humidity. The road leading to the site was rough and uneven, with potholes that rattled my truck as I drove. When I finally arrived, I parked near the entrance gate and stepped out to take a look around. The place was huge, several acres of buildings, overgrown parking lots, and fenced-off storage areas. The forest pressed in on all sides, tall pines and thick underbrush making it feel even more isolated. I had a small camper shell on the back of my truck, and I decided to set it up near the center of the property. It seemed like the best spot to keep an eye on things, and it gave me a little shelter in case of bad weather. That first night was uneventful. I walked the perimeter a few times, checked the locks on the buildings, and sat in my truck for the rest of the shift, sipping coffee and listening to the sounds of the forest. But on the second night, the rain started. I hadn't checked the forecast before heading out, and by the time I arrived at the site, the storm was already rolling in. Thick clouds blotted out the moon, and the rain came down in heavy sheets. The gravel road turned to mud, and the trees swayed in the wind, their branches creaking and groaning like old bones. I parked my truck in the same spot as before, near the center of the property, and climbed into the camper to wait it out. Hours passed. The rain didn't let up, and the only sounds were the drumming of water on the roof and the occasional rumble of thunder. I tried to stay focused, but there wasn't much to do. My flashlight beam barely cut through the rain, and the security cameras around the site were fogged up and useless. Around midnight, I decided to do a quick patrol, despite the weather. I pulled on my rain jacket, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped out into the storm. The rain soaked me instantly, but I pushed on, checking the locks on the main gate and the doors to the old factory buildings. Everything seemed normal. As I made my way back to the truck, something caught my eye. Near the edge of the property, where the forest crept up against the fence line, I saw a faint light. At first, I thought it was a reflection from my flashlight, but when I turned it off, the light was still there. A small, flickering glow like a candle or a lantern. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Trespassers weren't uncommon, but most of them were kids looking for a place to drink or party. They usually stayed closer to the road, not way out here in the woods. I decided to check it out. The ground was slippery with mud, and the rain made it hard to see, but I followed the light as best I could. It seemed to move, drifting deeper into the woods, just beyond the fence. I reached the edge of the property and stopped. The light was still there, about 50 yards into the trees. It didn't make sense. I climbed over the fence, my boots sinking into the soft earth as I landed on the other side. The forest felt different here, darker, more enclosed. The rain dripped through the canopy, and the underbrush clawed at my legs as I moved forward. The light was closer now, just ahead. When I reached it, I realized it wasn't a lantern or a candle. It was a small fire. Someone had built a makeshift campsite in the woods, a ring of stones around a pile of burning sticks, with a few scattered belongings nearby. A tarp stretched between two trees served as a shelter, and a battered backpack leaned against the trunk of a pine. I looked around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. There was no sign of anyone, but the fire was fresh. Whoever had built it couldn't be far. I called out, but my voice was swallowed by the rain. Something about the scene didn't feel right. The fire was too neat, too deliberate, and the belongings were too sparse. No food, no water, no bedding, just the backpack and the tarp. I moved closer, trying to get a better look, when I noticed something that made my stomach turn. The ground around the fire was covered in tracks, footprints, but not just one set. There were dozens of them, overlapping and crisscrossing in every direction. Some were small, like a child's, while others were larger, heavy enough to sink deep into the mud. I stood there, frozen, as the rain continued to pour. The tracks weren't heading toward the fire. They were leading away from it, deeper into the woods. I decided it was time to leave. I turned back the way I came, trying to retrace my steps, but the forest seemed different now. The trees were closer together, the underbrush thicker. My flashlight beam bounced off the rain, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. I reached the fence and climbed over, my heart pounding. The site was just as I'd left it, quiet, empty, but the feeling of unease stayed with me. I made my way back to the truck, locked the doors, and sat in the driver's seat, staring out at the rain. For the rest of the night, I stayed in the truck, watching the perimeter and listening for any signs of movement. The fire in the woods haunted me. The memory of those tracks burned into my mind. By the time morning came, the rain had stopped and the forest was still. I packed up my things and left the site, my tires spinning in the mud as I pulled onto the gravel road. I reported the incident to my supervisor, but there wasn't much they could do. The site was too remote, and the client wasn't interested in sending a team to investigate. I was reassigned to a different location a few days later, and I never went back to that property. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that fire, about the tracks leading away from it, deeper into the woods. And I wonder who or what was out there with me that rainy night in Georgia. I didn't think much of it when my cousin Tim asked me to join him on his latest camping trip. He's a scientist, a biologist to be exact, and over the past few years, he's been obsessed with studying forest ecosystems. He always picks remote spots for his research, away from everything. Usually, I'm the one tagging along for moral support, even though I know very little about his work. This trip, though, felt different. Tim had picked a secluded area in the Oregon wilderness, somewhere deep in the Cascade Range, for his experiment. The plan was simple. We'd camp out for a few nights, set up some equipment, and collect data on the local flora and fauna. Nothing too out of the ordinary, at least for him. But there was an odd sense of urgency in his voice when he asked me to come along. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something felt off. We drove up in his old truck, the kind that rattled more than it should, and arrived at the trailhead late in the afternoon. Tim was already in work mode, organizing his gear, checking the maps, and muttering to himself about different treatments he needed to apply to the forest samples. He had a few tools with him, nothing high-tech, just some basic research equipment like soil testers, plant identification guides, and a field notebook. But there was also something new this time, a large, heavy-duty camera strapped to his backpack, and a weird, long tube that he claimed would help him get soil samples from deeper layers of earth. "Everything's set for tonight," he said, more to himself than to me as he stuffed a few samples into his pack. I nodded but didn't feel reassured. We hiked for a couple of hours into the dense forest. The trees were towering giants, their bark thick with age, and the ground was covered in a blanket of moss that muffled our footsteps. Despite the beauty of the place, there was a strange, unsettling quiet around us. No birds, no animals scurrying through the underbrush. It wasn't normal for a forest this deep. Tim didn't seem to notice, too focused on the task at hand. By the time we reached the campsite, the sun had dipped behind the mountains, leaving the forest dim and shadowed. Tim set up a small tent and then immediately started digging in a nearby patch of dirt. I busied myself with the fire, though it was hard to shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. As the night grew darker, I began to notice more oddities. The air seemed to grow colder, despite the fact that it was still early summer. A thick fog started creeping in from the forest, swirling around the trees and adding an eerie haze to the already dim surroundings. I tried to ignore it, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "Just the humidity," Tim had said when I commented on the fog. He didn't seem concerned, but his focus was entirely on his work, not on the environment around him. Later that night, while I was lying in my sleeping bag, I heard a faint noise coming from the woods, a rustling, like something was moving through the trees. I lay still, trying to convince myself it was just a deer or some other animal, but it was strange. The noise wasn't the usual soft crunch of leaves underfoot. It was heavier, more deliberate, like someone or something was walking through the forest on two legs. My thoughts started to race. What could it be? A bear? Person? I strained my ears, trying to make sense of the sound, but it stopped as suddenly as it had started. I didn't mention it to Tim. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but the uneasy feeling lingered, and sleep didn't come easily. The next day, Tim set out to gather more samples, leaving me alone at the campsite. I tried to pass the time, reading a book and watching the forest, but the silence was overwhelming. At one point, I heard a twig snap nearby, followed by more rustling. My heart raced. I stood up, my eyes scanning the trees, but there was nothing there. No animals, no people, just the quiet, oppressive air. As the day wore on, things continued to feel off. The sounds of the forest, birds, insects, the occasional wind rustling through the leaves were absent. I began to feel a sense of isolation, like we were the only ones left in the world. Tim returned just before sunset, looking pleased with his findings. "Everything's going according to plan," he said, but his eyes were distant, as if something was bothering him too. We ate a quick meal and settled in for the night. The temperature dropped sharply again, and the fog thickened, wrapping the forest in an even heavier blanket. The trees loomed over us like dark sentinels, their branches swaying slightly in the wind, but the sound was muffled, unnaturally so. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud crash from the woods. Something had fallen, or maybe someone had knocked it over. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside the tent, shining it into the thick fog. My breath caught in my throat as I saw something moving in the distance. Shapes that didn't belong, shapes that were far too large to be animals. I turned back to Tim, who was still asleep in his tent. My heart hammered in my chest as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The figures weren't moving like any animal I knew. They were too tall, too bulky, like silhouettes of men, but they were too strange to be human. I stood frozen, my pulse racing, the beam of light shaking as I held the flashlight. The shapes seemed to drift through the fog, barely visible, but unmistakable. My mind raced, trying to think of an explanation, but I couldn't come up with one. Suddenly, a sharp, guttural sound broke the silence, like something growling, but far too deep to be from any animal I had ever heard. My breath hitched in my throat as the figures turned toward me, and for a split second, I thought I saw something glinting in the dark, something metallic, like eyes reflecting the light. I didn't know what they were, but I didn't stick around to find out. I rushed back into the tent and shook Tim awake. He groggily sat up, still half-dazed, and I tried to explain what I had seen, but he didn't seem to understand. "It's probably just some big animals," he said, rubbing his eyes. "We're deep in the forest. This place isn't as empty as it seems." But his words didn't comfort me. As the night stretched on, I could hear more movement in the woods, slow and deliberate, like something was circling the campsite. Whatever it was, it didn't sound like any animal I knew. The fog kept thickening, and the trees seemed to loom closer. When morning finally came, I was exhausted, but I had to know what had been lurking out there. I gathered my courage and followed Tim as he ventured out to collect his final samples. We moved cautiously, our senses on edge. The air was thick with fog, and the forest felt suffocating. And then we saw it, a set of tracks, deep and wide, leading off the trail and into the dense trees. They weren't from any animal I could identify. The prints were too large, too odd, and they seemed to circle the area, almost like something had been watching us. Tim knelt down, inspecting them closely, but there was no expression on his face. He just stood up and said, "We need to pack up and leave. Now." I didn't question him. We hurried to break down camp and make our way back to the truck, but the strange feeling never left. As we left the woods behind, the oppressive silence lifted, but the unease stayed with me. I never asked him what he thought about what we saw, but I know he knew more than he let on. We didn't speak much on the drive home, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we had stumbled upon something that wasn't supposed to be found. The tracks were still fresh in my mind, as if they were a warning. Something in those woods was not right, and whatever it wasn't interested in being discovered. I remember the night as clear as if it happened just yesterday. It wasn't even supposed to be that eventful. The idea was simple enough, just me, my best friend, and a weekend camping trip in the woods. We thought it'd be a nice break from the usual hustle of daily life, an escape from our phones, work, and the constant pressure to keep moving. But we didn't know what we were stepping into when we left the comfort of our homes and headed into those woods. We had planned to camp at this secluded spot near the edge of a national park. The place wasn't on any tourist maps, and it wasn't even marked with signs or trails. The land was dense with trees, an older part of the forest that hadn't seen much traffic in years. We'd read about it online in a local hiking forum, a place for experienced hikers and those looking for a more rugged, untouched spot. At least that's what we thought we were getting. The drive out was peaceful enough. The weather was perfect, crisp and cool, but not too cold. The sky was clear, and we even saw a few deer grazing in the distance as we drove along the narrow dirt roads that led to the trailhead. We joked about how the area seemed almost too perfect, like something out of a travel brochure. We pulled off the road, gathered our gear, and set off toward the woods. The trail was barely visible at times, and we had to push through thick brush and overgrown paths. It felt like the forest was slowly trying to reclaim the land, as if it didn't want us there. But we were used to that. After all, we had hiked in tough spots before. This wasn't anything we couldn't handle. After about 2 hours, we reached the site we had chosen. A small clearing near a creek, surrounded by tall pines and thick ferns. It was peaceful, just the sound of the creek bubbling over rocks and the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. We set up camp quickly, eager to enjoy the evening. There were no other campers around, which made the place feel even more isolated. As night fell, we started a fire and roasted marshmallows. The sky above was dotted with stars, and the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the wind moving through the trees. We had our usual banter, talking about everything from work to old high school memories. The firelight flickered across our faces, casting shadows that seemed to dance and play tricks on the mind. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling creeping up on me. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on. It wasn't an obvious danger, but something about the silence, the remoteness, felt wrong. It was too quiet. Normally, you'd hear wildlife, owls, the rustling of small animals, maybe even the distant howl of a coyote, but it was just empty. I tried to ignore it. The fire was warm, and we were enjoying ourselves. But the longer I sat there, the more I kept glancing around, feeling like something was off. It was like being watched. I shook it off as paranoia. My friend was already half asleep, leaning back against a log, eyes closed. That's when I first heard it, a twig snapping. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But then it happened again, closer this time. My heart skipped. It was a definite snap, like someone stepping on it intentionally. Not an animal. I stared into the darkness beyond the firelight, straining to see anything. My friend didn't notice, lost in a half-dreamlike state. I thought I saw movement, a shadow shifting quickly through the trees, but when I blinked, it was gone. I brushed it off as my imagination playing tricks. We were in the middle of nowhere, after all. But then the feeling didn't go away. It lingered. An hour later, we finally decided to turn in. I laid in my tent, wrapped in my sleeping bag, trying to fall asleep. But the rustling sounds outside, the faint, almost imperceptible sounds of something moving, kept me awake. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind. The trees were thick, and they often creaked and groaned with the breeze. Sleep didn't come easily. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that weren't the wind or an animal. Someone was walking around our campsite. My heart pounded in my chest as I held my breath, listening intently. They circled our camp, moving just outside the range of the firelight, careful not to reveal themselves. The footsteps came closer to my tent. I froze. What if it was someone else camping nearby, just out of sight? But why would they be walking around our site at this hour? The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I held my breath, not daring to make a sound. Seconds stretched into what felt like minutes. Then, just as quickly as they had come, the footsteps faded into the woods, becoming softer and softer until they were gone. I stayed awake the rest of the night, straining to hear anything else. But there was nothing, not a sound. By morning, I was exhausted, my mind racing with questions and fears I couldn't answer. I didn't bring it up to my friend. She was still sound asleep, and I didn't want to freak her out for no reason. We packed up camp and decided to hike out, taking the long route back. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone out there, that something was following us, just out of sight. As we hiked, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something lurking in the trees. But there was nothing, only the wind and the occasional bird call. It wasn't until we reached the trailhead that I finally relaxed, feeling the comfort of civilization just within reach. But as we loaded our gear into the car, I noticed something strange. In the dirt near the base of a tree by our campsite, there was a set of footprints. Large, heavy footprints that weren't there when we had first arrived. They weren't human, but they were too big to be an animal. A bear? No, it didn't look right. The prints were too uniform. I glanced around, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck rise. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the trees, far off, but clear enough to make my stomach churn. A figure, standing motionless, watching us from the shadows. I didn't say a word. We both got in the car, slammed the doors, and I floored the accelerator, speeding down the road without looking back. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, the footsteps, and the figure in the trees. And I haven't gone camping since. It was the last shift of the week, and I had drawn the night shift. The camp was quiet, too quiet, nestled in the dense woods of the Cascade Mountains. I was 28, new to the whole camping ranger role, and still getting used to the solitude that came with the late hours. The night air was crisp, carrying that sharp, pine-scented chill, a stark contrast to the warmth that clung to the fire pit just hours before. The camp, if I'm honest, felt off. Maybe it was the looming shadows cast by the trees that surrounded the site, or the fact that the usual campers had all packed up and left a day earlier. Either way, it wasn't the kind of place you'd want to be alone in at night. But that was my job. A full moon hung in the sky, providing some light, but it only made the shadows deeper, stretching across the ground in a way that made everything feel wrong. I sat at the small ranger station by the parking lot, a little cabin with a flickering light above the door. My shift would be a long one, starting at 10 p.m. and running through until sunrise. It was too late for hikers to be coming in, and too early for the usual morning crowd to start rolling in. The place was mine, and I was stuck in it. The radio crackled to life, a burst of static followed by the voice of a fellow ranger on a neighboring shift. "Everything good over there, Nate?" His voice was calm, too calm, considering the setting. "Yeah," I responded, adjusting the radio, trying to focus. "All quiet, maybe too quiet. Got it. Just keep an eye out. These woods can get interesting this time of night." Interesting. That was his way of warning me without outright saying it. There had been stories, whispers really, that something wasn't quite right about these woods. A few rangers had quit after just a few months, refusing to go back in. Some said it was just the isolation that did it, but the ones that stayed never spoke much about it. I leaned back in my chair and glanced out of the small cabin window, the dim glow of the moon barely illuminating the trailhead. It wasn't unusual for a few campers to make their way in at night. I could hear the distant sound of rustling, something moving through the brush, but nothing ever came into view, just more shadows. The night was growing colder, and I reached for the logbook, checking the notes from the previous shifts. Everything looked normal. That was until I saw a note that was unlike the others. "Check around the old fire pit site. Strange marks found. Could be animals or something else. I frowned, feeling a knot twist in my stomach. The fire pit site was out of the way, not far, but far enough that you had to intentionally walk there. No one had mentioned anything about strange marks before. There was something unsettling about that particular part of the camp. It had always felt abandoned, forgotten by most. I glanced at the clock. 2:30 a.m. It was quiet, too quiet, and the restlessness in my chest was building. I grabbed the flashlight and slipped on my jacket. The radio crackled again. "Everything still good?" The other ranger's voice came through. "Yeah, just heading to check something out," I replied, trying to sound calm. I wasn't sure what I was walking into, but something told me this wasn't going to be a normal night. The path to the fire pit was narrow and overgrown, winding through thick trees that made the shadows seem alive. I stepped lightly, my boots crunching softly against the dry, fallen leaves. I had been out here enough times during the day, but at night, everything changed. The woods had a way of swallowing sounds. Even the wind felt like it was holding its breath. When I reached the site, I stopped dead in my tracks. The fire pit was in its usual spot, stones arranged in a perfect circle. But the ground around it was different. There were marks, deep gouges in the dirt, like something had clawed its way across the earth. A chill ran through me as I knelt to inspect them. They weren't from any animal I recognized. The lines were too straight, too deliberate. They looked human. I stood up, my breath catching in my throat. I had been trained to handle odd situations, lost hikers, injured campers, the usual, but this felt wrong. I wasn't alone here. I could feel it. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and I turned toward the trees. Something moved in the distance. At first, it was just a flicker, but then I saw it clearly. A shadow darting between the trees, fast, too fast. I snapped the flashlight toward it, but by the time I did, it was gone. My heart hammered in my chest as I backed away toward the cabin. I wasn't about to get stuck out there, not with whatever the hell was lurking in the woods. The path back seemed longer now, the trees closer, the shadows deeper. The rustling in the bushes was louder now, like something was following me. But every time I turned, there was nothing. I reached the ranger station and slammed the door behind me. I wasn't sure what I'd seen, but I knew I wasn't going back out there tonight. The radio crackled again, and I snatched it up. "Everything all right, Nate?" the other ranger asked. Yeah, just had to check something. I'll be staying in for the night," I said, my voice a little shakier than I wanted it to be. "Copy that. Stay safe. It gets pretty wild out there after dark." I didn't respond, just turned the radio off and locked the door. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, something watching, waiting. The rest of the shift passed in a blur. I kept the lights on, the door locked, and tried not to look out the window. But the feeling never went away. Every time I glanced out, there was something, a shadow, a flicker in the trees, something that didn't belong. When dawn finally came, I breathed a sigh of relief. The sun had broken through the trees, casting its golden light across the camp. It was over. Whatever had been out there was gone. But I knew this wasn't the last time I'd be out there. Something about those marks by the fire pit stayed with me, lingering in the back of my mind. I had no idea what was going on in those woods, but I wasn't going to let it get the best of me. The next night, I wasn't on shift, but I found myself standing at the fire pit again, this time in the daylight. The strange marks were gone, replaced by fresh dirt, but something else was there, a set of footprints, human, and they were heading deeper into the woods. I had always been a fan of solo camping, the peace, the quiet, just me and nature. Something about being out in the woods, alone, always brought a certain clarity to my mind. I decided to head to the Francis Marion National Forest in South Carolina, a place I hadn't been before but had heard great things about. It was late October, a little colder than usual, but I figured it would add to the charm of the trip. The trees were beginning to turn shades of orange and red, and the air felt crisp, perfect for a long weekend of solitude. I packed my gear carefully: a small tent, a sleeping bag, a few canned meals, and some basic tools. I wanted to travel light, but I made sure to bring enough to stay safe. I hadn't done much camping in areas this remote, but the more isolated, the better, in my opinion. There was something comforting about knowing I wouldn't see a soul for days. Arriving at the trailhead, I made my way down the path. The further I walked, the more it seemed like I was the only one who had ever passed through this place. The thick trees overhead blocked out much of the sunlight, casting long shadows across the ground. The only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves as a light breeze swept through. As I continued down the path, I noticed how quiet it was. Too quiet. There was no chirping of birds, no hum of insects, just an eerie stillness. I shook it off as nothing more than my imagination. After all, I was alone in the woods, far from civilization. It was easy to start thinking things were strange when there was no one else around. After about an hour of hiking, I found a decent spot near a creek to set up camp. The area was secluded, with thick trees surrounding the space and a slight rise in the ground that kept me hidden from any distant hikers, should there be any. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and started a fire. The smell of burning wood was comforting, and I sat by it, watching the flames flicker as darkness started to fall. Night came quickly. The wind picked up, sending a chill through the air. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows across the trees. I ate some canned beans, then settled down for the night. But sleep didn't come easily. It wasn't that I was scared, but there was a heaviness in the air. It felt like something was watching me. I kept hearing rustling noises around the camp, but when I checked, there was nothing there. I figured it was just animals, maybe a raccoon or a deer. I finally drifted off, but it wasn't a restful sleep. I kept waking up, hearing strange noises around the camp. Every time, I'd convince myself it was just the wind or the forest settling. But each time, I felt more and more on edge. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Not the random scampering of an animal, but the sound of someone walking through the woods. I froze. My heart began to race. I strained to hear, but the footsteps stopped as suddenly as they had started. I waited for what felt like hours, but there was nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself that I had imagined it or that it was some wild animal wandering too close to my camp. The next morning, I woke up with the sun, trying to shake off the strange feeling from the night before. I made coffee, packed up my camp, and decided to take a walk along the creek to clear my head. The morning air was crisp, and the sound of the water running over the rocks was calming. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The woods felt different now. There was no wind, no rustling leaves, just silence. I followed the creek for a while, hoping that the walk would help me relax. But the silence was unsettling. I was deep into the forest now, far from any trailheads, and the silence felt suffocating. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. I felt exposed, like there was someone watching from the shadows. I tried to focus on the scenery, on the trees, on the beauty of the untouched land around me, but my mind kept returning to the footsteps I'd heard the night before. I couldn't shake the thought that I wasn't alone out here, but there was no one, no other campers, no hikers, just the solitude I had come for. As I walked, I stumbled across something strange. A small clearing with a few trees that had been cut down, their stumps barely visible in the overgrown grass. It didn't look like any logging had been done recently, but the stumps were fresh, as if the trees had been cut down only a few weeks ago. My curiosity piqued. I stepped closer, but then something caught my eye. A pile of broken branches, almost too neatly arranged, at the base of one of the stumps. I bent down to take a closer look and saw that the branches weren't just randomly broken. They were arranged in a deliberate pattern, almost like a small trap or a signal of some sort. A chill ran down my spine. I quickly stood up, scanning the area around me. My mind was racing now, and the forest no longer felt like the peaceful place I had sought out. Felt wrong. I decided to leave the clearing and head back to camp. As I retraced my steps, the silence seemed even more oppressive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I walked faster, eager to get back to the relative safety of my tent. The more I walked, the more I felt like I was being watched. When I reached my campsite, I immediately noticed something strange. The fire pit was disturbed, the rocks rearranged, as if someone had been there while I was away. I hadn't been gone long, only a couple of hours, but someone had clearly been here. My stomach dropped. I scanned the area, looking for any signs of another person, but there was nothing. No tracks in the dirt, no trail leading away from the camp, just the unsettling sense that something was wrong. I grabbed my pack, stuffed everything back inside, and started to break down camp. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, and I didn't want to be here when night fell. But before I could finish packing, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the woods behind me. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I wasn't imagining it this time. There was someone out there. I quickly grabbed my flashlight and turned it on, shining it in the direction of the noise. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was no one there. The footsteps had stopped. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I finished packing as quickly as I could, my hands shaking. I didn't care if I left some things behind. I just wanted to get out. I started back down the trail, my eyes darting around, expecting someone to jump out at any moment. The woods felt alive now, each shadow holding something hidden. I could hear the faint sound of movement behind me, but whenever I looked, there was nothing. I kept walking, faster now, almost running, but the sound of footsteps behind me grew louder, closer. Panic set in. I didn't dare look back, afraid of what I might see. I just focused on the trail ahead, willing my legs to carry me faster. The deeper I went into the forest, the more isolated I felt. It was as if the world had closed in around me, and I was the only one left. Finally, I reached the edge of the forest, where the trail opened up into a clearing. I didn't stop to look back, didn't stop until I reached my car, parked on the edge of the forest. I threw my pack into the trunk, slammed the door, and sped away without looking back. I didn't stop driving until I hit the nearest town. My heart was still racing, and the feeling of being watched lingered. I didn't know who or what had been out there, but I was sure of one thing. I had been followed, and I was never going camping alone again.